You know how many times users searched football on eBay.com last season? Try 12,000 per hour. That's because eBay has been the home of collectibles since 1995 with an unrivaled selection of trading cards and memorabilia. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia, all the epic finds you need are right here on eBay. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going straight to ebay.com/theathletic. That's ebay.com/theathletic. Get busy building your collection today.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
The Race F1 podcast is brought to you by Merrill. It's no secret that finances can get complicated. Like me, I'm sure many of you listening will have financial goals. Perhaps it's even saving up for that trip to a Grand Prix far afield. Whatever your goals are, from starting a business to saving for kids' college to getting more stamps in your passport, you want a straightforward path there. But life tends to have other plans, and things get in your way. Merrill understands that. That's why with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalised plan that can help keep your money in sync with your life. So with the bull at your back, no matter what life brings, you get a clear path forward. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and with the top drivers in F1's primary feeder series being overlooked and ostensibly lowlier ranked drivers getting the breaks, there's question marks about whether F2 and by extension the rungs below it in the ladder are as relevant as they once were. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to tackle that question and unpick the strengths and weaknesses of the feeder series are Samarth Kanal and special guest Nelson Valkenburg. Well, Nelson, we'll come to you first. Welcome back to the podcast. We've had you on.
Glad to be here.
Exactly, yeah. Dutch Formula One commentator, but also someone who's steeped in junior single-seater racing. Perhaps you could show us your credentials.
Well, it is difficult on a podcast to show you, but I grew up on track. My parents owned an international racing team for the majority of my lifetime. Grew up racing Formula Fords as was and Formula Renault. So yes, working with 15-year-old drivers who needed to bring a lot of budget is sort of my forte, or it used to be at least.
Extracting money from people, that's
extracting money and drying some tears. Yeah.
Well, that's going to be a regular topic during this particular debate. Yeah. And Samarth, welcome back. Obviously, as well as doing F1 stuff this year and our technical stuff, you've also been doing a lot of Formula 2 following this year. So those are your credentials, such as they are.
Yeah, exactly. I would hope so. I don't have a junior Formula team at the moment. And after seeing F2 this season, I think I might shy away from that right now.
Yeah, it's been quite hard work in Formula 2. And it's funny, we've wanted to do this podcast for quite a while. And the timing has actually worked really well because it's a big talking point at the moment with some of the things that are going on. So before we get into the broader debates, there's a couple of topical aspects of this that I want us to address first as a kind of foundation. So Samarth, we'll come to you first, because at the heart of the debate we're going to have is the question of how to give young drivers chances. So before we get into that, it's worth reflecting on another potential door closing for 2024, at least, with that proposal to hold a 10-car rookie race at the postseason Abu Dhabi test being dismissed. Do you think that was a big missed opportunity?
Well, it's a funny one, isn't it? So I think the drivers themselves were quite positive, and you can guess which drivers were the most positive. That would be Kimi Antonelli, Ollie, Bearman, Gabriele Bortoleto. Obviously, the thing that connects them is that they are part of junior F1 teams. I think Red Bull Junior Isaac Hadjar joked that he wouldn't want to be the mechanics in that situation. So they were generally pretty excited about the idea, and even the ones that weren't affiliated were even like, oh, this is a pretty good idea. And there's no doubt after seeing the field this season, I think a lot of the F2 drivers could step in and do a sprint race. Let's say it would be a short sprint race in F1 cars around Abu Dhabi. So I do think it's a missed opportunity in a sense, because it could have been one hell of a story, a really positive story for F1 and F2. It would have given 10 F2 drivers the chance to show what they're made of. And instead of an FP1 session where we often see, drivers come in and they have to complete a program, we could have seen a genuine shootout to see their proper unleashed race pace. So I think it would have been exciting, yeah. But I don't think it's a missed opportunity in that F1 tends to do half-baked ideas sometimes. And if we'd rushed into it this year and had a half-baked rookie race rather than like a fully fledged, well-thought-out event, I would have been quite disappointed. So I still think it's on the cards, so I don't think it's a missed opportunity in that sense. But I'm keen to know if you guys agree, really.
Well, if it's half-baked, it doesn't show off their potential, doesn't put F2 in a right light anyway. So I'd rather them wait for a year and do it really correctly, as you say, than just shoehorning it in and give us something negative to talk about for the entire winter until the first race rocks up. So, yeah, I agree with you. It's better to do it right, but it would have been a really cool event, and I really hope that it goes on next year and that it actually is a fixture for years to come.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be on the agenda for next year. I'm not entirely surprised it didn't come off because there were all sorts of logistical questions and cost cap questions. But the basic idea was quite nice. They were going to do it in a day. So the morning would have been the testing for tyre testing, and then they'll have a young driver car. And then there'd be the sprint qualifying and then a couple more hours of tyre testing and then the sprints kind of at the end of the day. So it would have been a nice real world, if you like, experience. Although a 10-car race would have looked a little bit iffy, I think, because I know they tried to sell TV companies on it and that kind of thing, but I think there were a few doubts about whether it was really worthwhile. So I'd love them to do it as a full 20-car sprint rookie event. I think that would be really good fun, and also if it's in for next year, then that would give teams time to recruit a couple of drivers, which I think would make it interesting.
I think also just to mention, I mean, there were a couple of issues with it in terms of it's hard to do it. And I think this is short notice. Let's say we've got about 2 months and a week from now until when it would be held-ish. I don't know. My maths is terrible. What I'm trying to say is the logistics are the tough part. So you would have to keep the F2 drivers and their coaches, their managers on standby. And then it wouldn't have been fair because, they haven't decided yet. A lot of teams have probably already decided their travel plans and what they're going to do for December. And then F1 teams would have needed more staff on standby to prepare the cars for the rookie sprint race. And then they hadn't nailed down whether fans would have come. So F1 didn't seem to have these details nailed down in Baku, which makes me think that's part of the reason why they decided to bin it. It just seemed like there's a lot of things that were still up in the air, and it just seemed like too much effort to keep it going.
Yeah, I know the last time they talked about this at the commission, there was a bit of surprise that they'd not really considered any of the logistics. So lots of teams said, oh yeah, we like this idea, but we're going to have to wait a few months actually to try and work some stuff out. And so it felt like there wasn't really enough of a sense of urgency. But obviously this problem of lack of opportunities for drivers is at the heart of the debate we're having. And this would have been an interesting thing to do, albeit it's not exactly transformative to have one sprint race. It would have been interesting and fun. I'd have certainly liked to have seen it. But there's obviously
sense of urgency within F1.
Exactly, yeah. Funny how that happens. But yeah. I think everybody thinks it's a good idea. So I think it'll happen. But they need to work it out. And sometimes F1 has a bit of a habit of thinking, we'll do that for next year. Then they sort of sit around not doing it for a bit. They really need to hammer it out properly for next year. And I hope they do it. But yeah, it's an interesting scenario. And obviously it's also a big topic, Nelson, because of the whole situation we've got with the drivers who are getting into F1. Because you've got Kimi Antonelli, who's 6th in Formula 2. He's got a Mercedes seat for next year. Ollie Bearman's down in 15th, has a Haas seat. Franco Colapinto was 6th when he dropped out of F2 to dive into what has been a hugely impressive stint in F1 with Williams. So I guess there's two conclusions we could draw. Either F1 teams are picking drivers from F2 who are just decent rather than outstanding, or F2 isn't really allowing the drivers to showcase their talent. So where do you come down on those two sides of the argument, or perhaps it's a slightly more complicated and nuanced spectrum?
I think it's probably like everything and anything a little bit more nuanced. It seems with Antonelli and even a little bit with Bearman that they were anointed before they came in this season. So their results, unless they made huge mistakes, would have been a little bit immaterial. And it looks like that with Oliver Bearman especially. Kimi Antonelli has been showing more performance of late, as has Bearman, and I think that reflects on where Prema is with the team. They started off the season shockingly bad with the new car, and that sort of skewed where the guys are in the championship. But there is a growing feeling, I think, in the F1 paddock amongst team principals that F2 doesn't really reflect, well, the standings don't reflect reality a lot in F2, and that the proof of the pudding is when you put them into an F1 car. You can see that both ways. Either the entire field is capable to do it, so you then look for certain aspects and drivers that are probably already linked to your brand, or there's something in the F2 championship, the way it's run, the way it's set up, the way the weekends unfold, that doesn't give you the clear picture of who's actually the best driver in this field. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but it makes it very difficult for F2 drivers to forge a path if you're not politically connected and only relying on results to get into F1. It makes it so difficult for these kids.
And Samarth, you've asked some of the F2 drivers, the front runners this year, about whether they're frustrated in any way by seeing some of the ostensibly lesser drivers getting chances. So how do you feel they see the situation? Are they just furious that they're up in the upper echelons of the standings and it's those below them getting it, or do they understand the limitations?
I think there is a general feeling, and it kind of echoes also what Nelson was saying, really, that, that is the case, that they do feel a bit overlooked. And it's funny, even Oliver Bearman at one point during a roundtable, he was asked, is Formula 2 a meritocracy? And he just stopped in his tracks, kind of looked at everyone and shifted his eyes and said, I'm not going to answer that. So there's a general feeling that you can easily be overlooked. But I also think that, isn't that just the nature of the beast in some ways? I mean, I do think there's a fundamental problem, but I think the Formula 2 drivers have also kind of accepted that that's just the way of life now, which is kind of punishing towards them. I think at that age, you're hoping for a lot more, and it is a bit of a machine that spits you out, is what I think. And I think that's the general feeling, really, that it's a bit of both. It's a bit dog eat dog, and at the same time, I am being a bit overlooked. And partly, the media and PR machine is to blame for that as well, because they've been hyping up this whole thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's our fault.
Always the media's fault.
Yes, clearly. Which is a default position in our company, so it works well. It's nice to see that it works on the race as well.
But it's funny, isn't it? Because obviously Formula 2 has produced very, very good racing. I remember someone involved with the Sky UK thing saying a few years ago, often F2 or maybe even GP2 at the time produces the best racing of the weekend, but we can't get anyone to watch it. So I'll show it live, and the viewing figures will be tiny. I don't know how it is for you, Nelson, in the Netherlands. Is it a similar kind of story?
Well, it's actually quite well supported, but I think in part that is thanks to Richard Verschoor, who is in the championship and actually does well and is quite a good character. So there is a storyline for us there to follow as well. But yeah, questions are being asked also on social media, and we see it in our feedback from drivers as well. That we talk in our commentary in F1 about Bearman and Antonelli and Colapinto, but we never mention Hadjar, for instance. And if you then go back to watch F2, you just sit there thinking, well, he's in the lead, but everybody's talking about the guy who's 10th. And then how do you sell that story? And I think that's part of the problem that we're just discussing.
But obviously it leans more towards being involved in the junior schemes of F1 teams, and most of those at the top of F2 are Gabriel Bortoletto's in the lead of the championship. He's McLaren affiliated. Isaac Hadjar's Red Bull affiliated. He's second. Zane Maloney's Sauber affiliated, although he's seen the writing on the wall and he's off to Formula E. Paul Aaron's
That's an affiliation that actually means very little, it seems.
It does, yes, mean very little, and I think his heading to Formula E shows that. Paul Aaron's the highest ranked unaffiliated driver, but he was on Mercedes books. Jack Crawford's fifth. He's with Aston Martin. You've got Antonelli, Colapinto, Martin's associated with Alpine. So there's lots of connections. It's not quite as simple as, there's midfield runners who are affiliated with F1 teams who are getting all the chances and the front runners aren't. So there's an element of happenstance there, isn't it, in terms of who's got opportunities. It's clear McLaren, for example, rate Bortoletto, but McLaren have got a driver lineup sewn up for some years with Norris and Piastri. So, Nelson, do you think some of it is just circumstantial in terms of what path you're on? Because you don't win F2 generally as an unaffiliated driver, do you? So your path in that regard is to an extent preordained. Because
no, I think Drugovic is probably the last one who was unaffiliated.
Good point. Yeah. Subsequently signed by Aston Martin. But.
Exactly. But it feels with these driver schemes that they're building drivers or are getting their roster full just in case they're in troubles, just in case someone has an injury or needs to get an operation for a last minute or
because it's just the done thing. It's just the thing you do because some are more enthusiastic than others.
And you would be negligent if you wouldn't. Look how it helped Ferrari to have Bearman. Look how it helped Bearman on the other hand. But people need to have plan B. But these drivers are sometimes too good to be plan B. And there's where the friction is. And everybody would love to see, an automatic upgrade to F1 driver if you're a champion. But how are you going to do it with the current state of F1 with no paid seats and only 10 teams on the grid? There is just no way to force that issue. So it's just everything's so on lockdown that it must be very tiring for these kids with a lot of dreams and a lot of money spent to then see that it could be just a dead end. Imagine if Hadjar gets the title and has nowhere to go. It just feels wrong to me, coming from single-seaters, that you work your entire career to get there, and then you're on the precipice. You're almost there, and then you can also see it falling away because you're just in F2. And I think it's a problematic situation for the long term.
Yeah, exactly. And it was strange because when this championship was created, when I say this championship, I mean going back to GP2. So that was created in 2005. It kind of revitalised the primary feeder series because F3000 had, in its latter days, become quite weak, and you see quite a few champions didn't graduate. That almost became the norm with F3000. And GP2 kind of revitalised it. So obviously you had Kovalainen versus Rosberg in that first year. Rosberg won it, then Hamilton won it, Hulkenberg won it. So Timo Glock as well. So it was quite a vibrant series, but it seems to have changed, and part of that is down to the wider landscape. But it's what illustrates the point is you've got someone like Christian Horner recently said, it's getting increasingly difficult to really judge people based on F2, which when you've got someone involved with Red Bull that's been in junior academy racing for a very long time, often in F2, that's a little bit concerning. But yeah, those the rookie race situation and the who's getting the chances debate just shows why this conversation is relevant.
Well, relevancy is the problem here, because if F2 loses its relevancy, then how are teams going to validate the budgets? Well, why ask 2 million, 2.5 million of a driver if you can't say this is your path into F1? And that must be also a bit of a scary situation for the organizers, because if it's not a feeder series, then what is it? And that's where we're headed to that question.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem. And we'll move on to the broader problems in the next part.
You saw that play when your QB dropped back, looked off the safety, and threw a dime deep for the go-ahead touchdown. That's not just hall-worthy, that's wall-worthy, and you can own a piece of it when you shop the unrivaled selection of trading cards and memorabilia on eBay, the home of collectibles since 1995. Huddle up with 132 million users around the world to find that rookie patch auto you can't find anywhere else. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia, all the epic finds you need are right here on eBay. Plus, with eBay Authenticity Guarantee for trading cards, you know that what you buy is the real deal. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going straight to ebay.com/theathletic. That's right, your collecting journey kicks off right here, right now at ebay.com/theathletic. Come through and collect with us today.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
This episode is brought to you by Merrill. We all have goals, and we all want to get to those goals, whether that's saving for a home renovation, that once-in-a-lifetime trip to your favourite Grand Prix, or even retirement. We all want a straightforward path to those goals, but the real world doesn't usually work that way. Merrill understands that. That's why with a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalised plan and a clear path forward. And having the bull at your back helps your whole financial life move with you. So when your plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer, registered investment advisor, member SIPC.
Right, Samarth, looking broadly at the junior ladder, and primarily we're talking about FIA, F2, F3 and the many F4 championships here, what exactly is the problem?
Yeah, I think Nelson touched on it a little bit there. Is the part of it is if you can't judge who's good and then you can't pull them up to Formula One, so you can't create a proper pathway, why is it worth a kid of the age of 17 to 18 giving so much money and so much time, so much effort to sit in that car and race for 14 rounds a season? Is it? I mean, the single-seater pyramid isn't quite a meritocracy. You need money, right? And you always have, but even more so now. So some of that money will come from sponsors. Some of that, crucially, will come from your family's pocket. So this season, Zach O'Sullivan actually bowed out of Formula 2 this season due to a lack of funding, and that's believed to be from sponsors because the people around him were trying to get local businesses from around Cheltenham in the UK to back him. It's a big shame. And that caused a bunch of Formula One drivers, when I asked them, to say that it was a big concern. So Fernando Alonso said it costs about 250,000 euros for a karting season now. So that's reflecting how motorsport itself is getting more expensive. But then Pierre Gasly said the price of Formula 2 might have already doubled in the last few years. So he said that you're talking about more than 2 million euros without any guarantee that you're actually going to make a living out of Formula 2. And Lewis Hamilton also interestingly touched on the fact that education takes a step back for these kids. So that's how much they're committing here. They can't go to school, they can't practice anything else. So it could leave some drivers stranded if they don't make it. Now you might think, motorsport is expensive, but in recent years, actually Formula 3 and Formula 2 have increased above inflation. Part of that is due to the Pirelli tyres. They aren't cheap. The parts are getting more expensive, rising above the consumer price index, which is how we measure inflation. So some teams, for example, say the new F3 car could be around 25% more expensive in the next few years for teams. And I'm hoping our living costs don't go up by 25% in the next year. They really shouldn't, given inflation's hovering around 2.2%. And God forbid, but imagine that much cost, and some of that gets reflected back onto the drivers. Now, the other issue is that obviously, as you touched upon, Ed, there isn't much in the way of options now. If you want to get to F1, you have to get an F1 super license, and that prioritizes FIA feeder series over, let's say, series that might be cheaper or might be an alternative way in, for example, IndyCar. So you get as many super license points for winning Formula 2 as you get for winning IndyCar. You get as many for winning Formula 3 as you get for winning the World Endurance Championship. And you get as many for winning FRECA, Formula Regional, as you get for winning Super Formula, which I think is a bit more of a senior championship than FRECA. So I wonder if you guys think that that's fair in a sense. And also, if that's limited pathways so much for drivers, I mean, it is a funny old world in that sense, and it seems a bit unfair on them.
Well, it limits competition because one thing that it eliminates from the landscape is if you go back 10 years, just a little bit more than 10 years to the golden period, you had the Renault World Series as well, which was kind of equal there with GP2. And in fact, there were probably a few years when actually the World Series was definitely a better championship than GP2. But if you're going to be a manufacturer and say you're Renault and you want to revive it or something, you think, well, there's no point in doing this if it doesn't have the super license points, and it becomes political, doesn't it? So it's not just the competition not working within the racing, but competition between series has been kind of dampened by the FIA understandably trying to rationalise the ladder, but the super license points effect has a negative impact in that regard as well.
Very much so. I would like to point out that part of the increase in costs and budgets is the FIA's relentless pursuit of safety. So part of what we're seeing is that cars are getting heavier because they're getting more safety features added on, but they're also getting more expensive because the safety features are expensive. There are new techniques of building monocoques, etc., etc. There's new things added to the new F3 car that the other cars didn't have, the older cars. So that is part of it. But I made a list and I talked with some teams. 500,000 euros for F4, 750 for Freca, ballpark, 1.3 for F3, as Samarth said, and 2.3 for F2, and it's just mind-boggling.
Is that F4 figure for a single F4 championship? Because quite often you get people doubling up.
Well, here it becomes a little bit convoluted because what most drivers do is Italian plus another program. And I know drivers have been spending upwards of 600 on that. But what a lot of drivers feel they have to do is 60, 70 odd test days with 3 sets of new Pirelli tires every day just to get qualifying right, because you need to be picked up in a junior series around F4 time. Otherwise, you're not top of mind. You're not going to be supported. You have no way into F1. So the onus is on the start of your season to outspend the competition, do extraordinary, incredibly amount of test days just so that you can qualify well, because overtaking in an F4 is not so easy. As we know, no DRS, and I hate saying it like that coming from Formula Ford, but that's a problem. But these kids and their parents are being made to spend so much money in the first 2-3 years of their career just to get onto a F1 junior program and then see if they can ride it out all the way to F2. But yeah, it is creating a problem in the lower junior ranks.
And it's difficult because the whole point of one make, which has obviously taken over, pretty much everything in single-seaters with only a very few exceptions, of which F1 is the obvious one, are spec series. And the whole point is that's meant to keep costs under control. Now, there's a certain amount of cost involved. You're not going to have cars of the performance and safety of F2 without spending a decent amount of money. You're not going to do it for 100,000 a year. That's just a fantasy world. But the level of the cost increase and the amount you're now having to spend surely has gone out of control and defeats the object of having a one-make series.
Absolutely. I mean, it's getting to the point where you could probably run a non-spec series, competitive series with different cars with this. And Nelson touched on it. Part of the reason it's getting so expensive is the safety features. We should say that. And Nelson was right by saying that. At the same time, you're thinking there's no competition here. So, for example, there's no different tyre suppliers. There's no different engine suppliers. There's no different gearbox suppliers, I think. I want to be right on that. But I suspect it's just Hewland for Formula 2, and I think Formula 3 has gone to a French manufacturer. Now, if you just have the one supplier, you've got to pay what they say. You can't go elsewhere. And also, if you're not happy with their performance, you don't really have a choice. You just have to kind of stick with it and live with it. And that's even more painful given, Mechachrome engines haven't exactly been the most reliable in the last few seasons. I will say this season they've been a bit better, to give them that credit, but they haven't exactly been the most reliable and foolproof. And a lot of F2 drivers have to bite their lip when talking about them, which is always painful. So there's no competition for parts. There's no competition for, as in what I mean by parts is the engine and gearbox. And then there's the funny thing, which is, even mechanics are kind of kept out of the loop, and the teams actually have no input when F2 designs a new car. So they didn't really ask the teams, what do we do? And that's funny to think. In a spec series, you're not consulting the teams, right? Is this okay with you? Is this front wing? Is this Venturi tunnel idea good with you? They didn't even ask them. So it almost seems like you're almost at the mercy of the promoter there when they release a new car, which F2 did this season and Formula 3 will do next season. You're almost at their mercy, right? It seems like a very punishing thing, but it also seems like if you don't want to pay, right, well, off you go, on your bike. That's how it is.
Yeah, the teams do benefit of the situation on the other hand, though, because if you are on the grid in F3 and F2, there are a lot of customers for that one seat because it's such a controlled environment, controlled grid. You can basically, together with the teams around you, ask a lot, and there's worth in that. But it just goes to show how different the world is to when I grew up. I remember my dad going every winter to the UK to build his Formula Fords in the Swift factory in Plymouth because he liked them to his spec. And that's exactly not what it is right now. And it will never be like that. It cannot be like that. But there is an element of control, as Samarth said, that makes it very difficult for teams to extract the most out of a situation, and the drivers to get to know these cars in a way that or tailor them to their needs in a way that they would like.
It also, not having multi-make junior single-seater racing removes an avenue for drivers with ability that don't have massive backing. Because let's say I've got a Formula 4 manufacturer, just for the sake of argument, seeing as you refer to Swift, then let's say I want to sell 20 cars to mediocre Samarth Kanal type drivers. I might think, hey, this Nelson guy, he's really quick, but he hasn't got much money. So here's either a deal, or there were cases where they'd get free cars and support.
A lot of careers were built on that situation.
Exactly. So you say, here you are. Here's a Van Diemen. You're Van Diemen's advertising driver, effectively, and someone who doesn't necessarily have backing can do that. Now, this was also in an era where there weren't that many F1 teams doing anything approaching a junior academy. Anything that existed was very, very, very informal, and there wasn't much. So they weren't kind of coexisting. But that's illustrative of something that does make life a little bit difficult. But it becomes difficult because when you remove the kind of the economic competition, which you do by obviously F3 and F2 are the same organisation, so they control everything. So when you look at where the money's being made, etc., everyone wants to run businesses that are profit making. You've still got teams that struggle. You've got drivers that struggle to pay, and then you've got a centralised organisation that's doing pretty well for itself, and that's fine because you want that organisation to be stable and be able to do the job properly. But it doesn't mean that the money's flowing around the ecosystem, and that's sort of what concerns me. It's like the motorsport industry in terms of chassis manufacturer and suppliers, etc., has got much smaller because of this. So that doesn't help push prices down because you're not competing. If you produce a gearbox that's as good for an F2 type car as someone else, but it's half the price, then you're going to do well out of it, aren't you? But that can't happen now. Yep. So it's the economic goalposts have moved dramatically.
Yeah, I think from a driver's standpoint, F4 is the problematic one, and there are a lot of kids in F4 at the moment. There are, by my reckoning, 7 different championships at least in Europe for F4. British F4, GB4, French F4, Italian, Spanish, Scandinavian, and Central European. And
there is at least some competition there in terms of not within championships, but at least there are some manufacturers operating in different places.
Yeah, but it means that there is about 150. There are 150 kids, give or take. Some are doing double programs that are trying to make the move up, and they are so pushed to outspend the others with testing and with just trying to catch the eye of a junior program that it's almost like mayhem on test days, and people just spending a lot to go in the winter testing in the Middle East or racing in the Toyota Series in New Zealand. Everybody wants to outspend the other, needs to outspend the other to get into a junior program or stay in a junior program, because there is that as well. It's just, it's not sustainable in the junior ranks, this.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another area where the lack of competition, because if you're not an F4 type series, I mean, F4 super license points aren't that significant, but they can make a difference. But again, that super license point structure can have an impact on reducing competition with other series. So it's difficult, though, because obviously if you go back, 10 years or a bit more, people would say, oh, it's too confusing, the junior ladder, so we need to consolidate all of this, and that'll be a good thing. And then that happens and it creates other problems. So it kind of shows there's no path that doesn't have unintended consequences.
Absolutely. I think it's inevitable. It's going to become quite convoluted in that sense, and that's a good thing, right? I mean, I don't think the path to Premier League football is that easy to understand sometimes. I don't think the path to, other top sports is that easy to comprehend. It's not going to be And that's a good thing because you have multiple pathways of coming in, lots of competition, lots of ways that people from different backgrounds that were losing. You threaten to kind of filter out people from different backgrounds. You threaten to filter out people who are quite talented and deserve to make it, and then just won't. By having this centralized, quite expensive and quite unattainable pathway. I mean, it's God forbid. Imagine if the UK government was full of private school kids filtered in through one tunnel, and then you missed out on actual talented people who want to do the job. So it's like that. You miss out on talent, and it's a shame. Really, it is a big shame that we potentially in the next couple of decades won't see drivers who really deserved a shot because they just couldn't make it. I think that's quite sad. That said, there's a lot of lucrative sponsors out there, so hopefully that can work out. But I'm not well versed in gaining sponsors or funding, and I imagine that's so difficult right now, given how everything's been since COVID. So yeah,
it is. It's impossible. I've dealt with this for a long time, and I still manage a couple of drivers on the side, and it's impossible to get the attention because everyone tends to suck a lot of the air out of the room, rightly so, because it is so popular. But people want to know, can you get to F1 and how are you going to say yes to that when you're 16 or 17? So it is difficult. But right now, the main beneficiary seems to be endurance racing. A lot of the kids with budget end up going to places where they can build a career, and they've seen the growth of hypercar at Le Mans and think, hey, this is going to be it. If they are very clever in the US, they market the hell out of Indy Next, what used to be Indy Lights, and then see that explode. And if that happens, then maybe the people in Europe actually scratch their heads and make some changes to the structure of F3 and F2 to make it maybe a little bit more accessible and relevant. Because, as I said, if it loses relevancy, endurance racing, but also the American side of racing will stand to gain. And I don't think they'd like that.
It's interesting, though, because as you say, there's still a lot of drivers who can make a professional career, and it's probably better than it has been at some times in terms of getting what you might call a pretty lucrative career. Because even if you're you have a reasonable sports car career, by normal standards, you're being very well paid to do a job you love. So that's not too bad. And then I mentioned Zane Maloney earlier. Yeah, he's not got a shot at F1, but he's got a paid professional drive in Formula E. So that's a good outcome for him. So you could argue that. You could also argue that, well, the cream rises, the F1 academies pick up all the best ones and they come through. And sometimes that's the case, but people do slip through the cracks. I mean, one interesting example from the past 10 years was Alex Palou, who didn't make a great impression in F3. I think he finished 10th in the championship. He did coming into GP3, as it was rather, there was a bit of talk about him pre-season because he was quite quick in testing, but then wasn't in the right machinery. And yeah, so he was kind of lost to the European system. Obviously went to Japan and then brilliant success in IndyCar. So you could say that's maybe a failure of the junior ladder in Europe. But that highlights another problem because another idea of one-make racing is everyone's got the same car. And yeah, you can do different setups, etc. But F3 in particular, as I would say, suffered from this in recent years. You've got to be in the right team because there are front-running teams, midfield teams, and backmarker no-hoper teams ultimately. And sometimes that's driven by what drivers they've got, and you get a self-sustaining thing. Because if you've got bad drivers one year, you get bad drivers the next year because you're down the queue, and the ones with the big backing and the F1 support go elsewhere. So how do you unpick that, Nelson?
Well, there's another strand to that, just to add a strand, not to unpick it, is that if you have the budget, then you can go to Spain or to the Middle East to test similar machinery. It's not allowed to test exact same cars and especially not on tracks that you're racing, but you could do a whole testing series with similar cars or maybe the previous generation cars. And there's a lot of inequality there.
Or sometimes you get those cars that are called hybrids, don't you?
Yes.
They used to do that in the World Series and F2 times, and you might bolt a rear end on, and then you say, well, there's your sort of second tier test car, and
exactly.
Not hybrids in the electrical sense. But yeah, that's been a common trick for a while.
Yeah, so there's a lot of inequality there. So say you have the budget to do it, and you come into your first F3 year, and you're a rookie, but you qualify 6th or 10th or whatever because you're so familiar with what's needed with these cars. then suddenly you're on a different trajectory. But it is right, and it will always be like this. And it's also not a big problem to me that there are good teams and bad teams, because that's just the nature of sport. Otherwise, our sport is also one of engineers, and they are also competing against one another. So if you take that element away, I think a lot of people, but at least I would lose a lot of interest, because that's part of it. But once it becomes baked in, as you said, then you get sort of 2 tiers, maybe even 3 tiers of teams in F3. And that strengthens the position of the leading teams even more. So it's just such a minefield, and F3 is difficult to come through. It's interesting to see what Kimi Antonelli did, and he might even be right. And I think they're afraid of it in F3, that the precedent that Antonelli set to do FRECA, Formula Regional by Alpine, and then move into F2 is paying off, because he knew he was on the right trajectory. It comes down to that relevancy again, and I think people are afraid of it.
Yeah, it's that question of good and bad teams is interesting, because there's also an element of degrees, isn't there? We've talked a lot on this podcast about Daniel Ricciardo recently, and obviously he got into Red Bull he didn't have a great deal of money, but he had enough to sort of scrape together to do Italian Formula Renault. He did it with RP Motorsport, I think it was, who were a solid enough
more
team.
More than decent team.
Yeah, a decent team, but not a super team, not perennial championship winners. I think he finished 6th in the championship, but caught Red Bull's eye, got a test, and then got in, and his career supported. If he hadn't performed that well in that team, then he'd have probably disappeared from racing or just become a minor character, and no one would have heard of him. So I guess there's the question of, can you still do that? That's the big question. I mean, Samarth, obviously you're all over F2 and keep an eye on F3 as well, but do you think it's still possible to do that if, let's say, you're an unaffiliated driver in a championship, to actually catch the eye?
Gosh, it's seriously difficult. I think it's possible, but it's going to be difficult. And Formula One teams are going to stick by the person they've invested loads of money in the first place. Part of that is going to be a lack of acceptance that they've made the wrong choice, even. So they don't want to, they want to validate the choice they've made in terms of drivers in their academy, and part of that is, and most of that I'd like to say, is because they've invested a lot of money, a lot of time into a driver. So it would be quite hard to replace a driver in a junior academy with an unaffiliated one. But I guess Paul Aaron is the story this season, isn't he? In that sense, he's the driver that almost kind of caught the eye of some driver academies, and the problem is there's not that many driver academies really, and especially ones that are quite useful. For example, you could pick a team like Aston Martin, but theirs isn't really a driver academy in the same way that you'd call Williams one a proper pathway. Williams is a proper one that you invest in a driver and try and send them into F1. So Paul Aaron doesn't have many choices. Also, he's kind of fallen off the wayside a bit recently, so it's not been easy for him in recent races. But yeah, it will happen. I don't think it's impossible, but I think the chances are quite slim.
Also, at the same time, you see the academies picking up drivers that are younger and younger and younger. In Zandvoort, we had an interview with a Dutch kid, Dean Hogendorn, who was signed by Williams that weekend as their development driver for the junior program. He's 12. A couple of weeks ago, Tom Coronel's son, Rocco Coronel, who's very quick, has been announced as a Red Bull junior. He's 13. He's not allowed to race cars for a while now. There is this arms race between drivers and also between academies. So it's such an interesting playing field right now. And I agree with Samarth that if you're really out of the loop, trying to fight yourself into contention is so difficult. And imagine all these drivers, maybe 15 on the F3 grid, that know they have no chance to get into the conversation. But they are spending the money because they are chasing a dream. And I think it's right to also say that in that respect, the sport hasn't changed a lot because it's always been like this, right? If you had the money, you had the gear to do well in F2 or F3. But I think we'd like to think that there were also opportunities. And I think the sport owes it to itself to maintain to maintain those opportunities, to make sure there's always a way if you do not have budget, except from just knocking on the door of an F1 team and say, please help me, but just making it by doing a good job along the way. I think that's the ideal we're all looking for.
Yeah, and it's especially important given that F1 makes a big thing about wanting to improve diversity, etc. So it is important to try and create other alternative pathways. But yeah, it's a complicated old situation. Yeah, that battle to get the next big thing in karting and talent scouts is extremely intense now. You can't just spot someone one day doing a good job and suddenly sign them up because you'll have been beaten to them. And it is interesting how different teams approach it, because Williams were a latecomer to the Drive for Academy thing because they couldn't really afford to do it, and then Doralton took over, and funnily enough they've now been quite prolific because they've put 2 drivers into F1 in Logan Sargent and Franco Colapinto, and then that has the virtuous circle effect, because then if everyone's fighting over the next Antonelli, who's a 12-year-old karter, then Williams can say, well, look, we've got a pathway that goes somewhere, these other teams don't necessarily. Aston Martin, what are they going to do for you? So yeah, that's an interesting battleground.
It could be helpful if we just have a few more teams on the grid in F1. Just throwing it out there.
Well, if only there were an F1 organisation capable of doing it that we're trying to get in. If only.
Well, but all joking aside, the HRT was rubbish, but it gave people a chance into F1.
Yeah, Daniel Ricciardo had his first taste of F1 there. Yeah, you do. Ultimately, Formula 1 should be working towards a full grid. I think 26 cars would be a good number to go for. So, and you're right, not just the number of seats, but the stability of seats means that not many drivers get into F1, so there's a sort of tighter bottleneck than there perhaps ever was. So yeah, it's just problem after problem.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
The Acura ZDX is more than just 100% electric. It's 100% Acura energy. With nearly 500 horsepower and an impressive range rating, the ZDX Type S delivers 100% excitement and brings unprecedented performance to the Type S family. And it's 100% loaded with innovative features like an 18-speaker Bang & Olufsen premium sound system, available hands-free cruise, and Google built-in. Test drive the Acura ZDX and unlock electrified performance today.
This episode is supported by Merrill. With a dedicated Merrill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merrill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Right, let's get on to how to fix it, Nelson. I'm tasking you with answering that. I'm appointing you head of the FIA Single-Seater Commission, giving you full power to make whatever changes you think are necessary. So what do you do?
Who am I replacing there? I think it was Giancarlo Minardi who's still there, or a few interesting names.
It's a hypothetical. We're not sacking anyone hypothetically. We're just
I was already spending the money.
Consider this your audition.
Spending the budget. How to solve it? I think a cap on extracurricular activities for the junior drivers. No extra testing. It sounds harsh because we all want to develop drivers, and to say to a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old you're only allowed to do 10 test days sounds very harsh, but really police it. And that means being there on those test days that nobody really sees in the winter, where they're spending 80,000 on tires. Really police it. And that also means saying to Pirelli, you're only selling tires for events that are part of the championship, not free testing. The teams will hate it because that's part of their income. But that's the only way I see to solve it, to take away a lot of the inequality that's currently in the junior ranks, and also a lot of the explosion of prices at the moment in the junior ranks. Get it to a sensible level. 500,000 euros for a 16-year-old is not a sensible level. How quick, how safe the car may be. Part of it, as Samarth said, is tires. So take that approach, and Pirelli will not like you for it, and the teams will not like you for it, but I'm pretty sure in the long run, the drivers will thank you for it. And that will then trickle down or trickle up, if that's physically possible, to getting the right drivers into FRECA, into Formula 3 and F2, because they were able to show what their worth is in F4. Also, make sure that champions have a seat in the next category, and that means investment from the FIA into just buying a seat. For if you're doing Italian F4, you should be guaranteed to go to FRECA or F3 if you're a champion, because that's how good you are, and that means that you're reinvesting into the sport. I might lose this hypothetical seat at the table because I'm spending the FIA's money here, but I think taking away a lot of the extra costs early in the career will solve a lot of the problems.
And then, of course, you've got the problem there, Samarth, of how do teams make it work if you're removing revenue streams, because it's hard work running a junior Formula race team, isn't it? So can this economic system be balanced up?
Oh, that is a really tough one. I don't think so. I think the current system is just working too well financially for some people and some teams, and it just seems too hard to kind of get away from that. It seems really hard to balance that up. I mean, teams now relying on mega sponsorship and TV deals as well, which is really good. So that wouldn't change in Nelson's plan, at least, which is great. I hope, right? You're keeping that.
I might get some threats here and there from some teams, but there we go.
Yeah, it's the extracurricular activities that they might also find a bit difficult, because I don't know if that provides a revenue stream for teams, does it?
It does. It does.
In that sense, they feel threatened.
There are teams out there currently that are in the F2, F3 biosphere, as it were, that also run cars in different championships. And there's a team that told me the other day they run about 50, 60 cars per year in different series. So these are not the average teams from 20 years ago. These are incredible businesses. So yeah, they need to be making a lot of money also to keep that going, and have drivers spend money here, there, and in the winter keep them interested. So yeah, it is an interesting situation. The sport has grown into something else than we used to know it.
And they try and control it, don't they? Because there have long been testing bans in place, and then people find ways around them in all sorts of clever ways. And there's even restrictions on whether you can race in other championships if you need permission. Obviously in F3, Stenchel and Solov were banned earlier this year, weren't they? Because they didn't get permission to race elsewhere outside of F3. So they try and... In terms of the broader fix, there's part of me, and I don't like looking to the past for solutions. It tends to go wrong. But there's part of me that quite likes the idea of trying to move back towards more chassis competition. But how do you then do that without then ballooning costs in that regard? Even if you could find the companies to do it, and a lot of these chassis manufacturers that used to exist, the small ones, just don't anymore, and wouldn't have the technology to operate in the same way because of what you were talking about earlier. So is multi-make a viable thing to do? Or I feel it's something I'd like by inclination, but I think practically it doesn't work.
Is the FIA still able to build a regulation set that's open to competition is the question, because I think the last time they did it, not in F1, is probably the 2017 LMP2 regulations. And that was dominated to such an extent by one manufacturer, Orica, that they had to almost do some BOP to get the Lara and Ligier back in the game. So it is very difficult right now with how the sport has evolved. Are there manufacturers still able to do it? We've got the Lara and Tatus, maybe also Miguel in France, but right now...
Dome in Japan?
Yes, but they've also been very used to building cars they actually design the regulations for. So it has taken away that. It could work because it also develops engineers for F1 if we actually all learn again how to build a car.
That's really important, because there were generations who were come into F1, but they've already designed Formula Ford cars, etc., from the ground up. You can't do that anymore.
No.
Generally, okay, you could get into a design program for a Spec chassis, but that does narrow the training ground.
Yeah, but I'm afraid, and I've had to swallow that pill a long time ago. I think that's the way our sport has gone into that direction. And I'm not sure we'll be able, the three of us, to get it back to where we would like it to be. But just take a lot of the extra costs out at the junior level. I think then at least you have a leveler playing field at the beginning of your career.
Well, that's very true. And it's all never going to be completely level. And we can have sympathy for those who don't get into a good F3 seat or something. But most who start on the path won't even get to that level and will look on it enviously. Some will never have the chance to even get into a kart or anything. But you can argue if it works okay economically, and if the cream does rise, then it's okay. Max Verstappen made it to Formula One, and you could argue, he always would have done because of the ability level. But
I don't agree with that.
Well, that's the thing.
No.
It can be very easy to work backwards and think, well, of course this was going to happen.
Yeah, Max Verstappen had 1 year of F3 because basically there was budget of 1 year of F3 and they really needed to be picked up. And they used, I think, every avenue. They had a lot of support midway through the season, also from some sponsorship in the Netherlands. But I don't believe they would have had the budget to move to GP2 or F2 at that point and pay for it themselves if they needed to. It was, I think, win or bust for Max. In hindsight, we all know what happened, but it was a huge gamble. And Jos believed so much in Max that he knew he was going to do it. He prepared him incredibly well for it, spent a lot of his own money preparing him to hit the track running. Goes to the story we just talked about. But I don't believe if Red Bull or Mercedes hadn't picked him up, he would have been able to get the budget to shine in F2. And we would have lost one of the talents in F1 through no fault of his own.
It also makes you think, because you often have stories like that where you have families or supporters, putting everything on the line to fund a driver, and then they get success. And you hear these stories of, my parents mortgaged their house or whatever, or did this, that, and the other, and it's all paid off. And you think, well, how many people have done things like that and it's not worked out? So there's all sorts of financial damage to individuals. I mean, ultimately, that's up to them if they want to take the risk. But yeah, it becomes very, very, very difficult to know for certain how well things can progress. And obviously, it's distorted further and made even more higher stakes by the fact that drivers have got younger. If you see what I mean in that.
Yeah, there is just no certainty in this sport. And it's if you had certainty, it wouldn't be a sport, I guess.
True.
But there are a few sports like this where the financial implications of failure are so big. And we know Esteban Ocon and his family had to eke out every euro they had to have him reach a level. And I'm very happy for them they made it. But yeah, as you say, I know so many kids who didn't, and you spend everything on a dream.
Yeah, it's great when the dream comes true, but it doesn't for many. Although you can argue that in terms of F1, because a lot of the drivers in F1 didn't have megabucks infinite backing, did they? Ocon's one example, but there's quite a few of them actually who have had to get there based on success and the odd financial risk and delivering. So we don't want to give the impression that nothing's working, because like you say, there's always limitations, particularly in motorsport. It's all sports to an extent require investment. Even people say, football doesn't cost anything. It's like, well, if you've got a kid who's in academies, you might have to be investing huge amounts of time in driving them around and taking them places. That might impact your work. So there's an investment for everything, but motorsport, just because of the sheer cost of running things, is going to be steep. But somehow we've talked about how we might try and fix it. What impression are you getting of the direction of travel for all of this? Because it seems like the pathway is pretty much set in that we've got this structure, and F4, F3, F2 is kind of the key ladder. I mean, it's been a long time since the drivers got into F1 without doing that. I guess Pietro Fittipaldi would be the last one. He did old F3, and you sort of had European F3 and GP3 merged to create new F3, the one make version. Old F3, I mean, ostensibly multi, making a degree of freedom. So drivers are coming through this pathway now, and that seems to be the way it's going to stay. So what's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, it's going to stay. It is just going to remain like this. It's too lucrative for the governing body and the suppliers not to let it stay like this, unfortunately. It is going to stay like this. They've also committed to this pathway. So unfortunately, yeah, it seems like there's a little change on the horizon. I mean, you're not going to realize what you've lost because those drivers are going to get lost by the wayside pretty early on, I think. Motorsport is a pretty expensive sport to get into now from the get-go. I mean, even karting itself. So it's just going to be something that people don't pick up as much, I think. But on a grassroots level, I'd say people are picking it up, which is a great thing. So while it might not be a career for some people, it could be a very good hobby for some people, which is great. You know, there's no discounting that motorsport can still be accessible in lower tiers, which is nice. But yeah, in terms of an absolute career, it's going to stay like this. It's going to stay in the FI single-seater pyramid if you want to get to F1, and you've got to commit a lot of time, a lot of money to do it, which is a big shame. But it just seems to be the way it's been. I mean, I just want to add, I mean, in terms of cost cutting, one of the great things would be to keep the calendar a bit smaller, really, and let it just race around Europe. But then there's pressure on F2 and F3 to kind of go to the Middle East, go to Australia is one of the rounds. We've got Qatar as well, and Abu Dhabi as well. I mean, they don't go to the US, but you know, they do seem to go eastwards. So there seems to be a lot of pressure to expand outside Europe. Otherwise, it'd probably be called the Formula 2 European Regional Championship or something, which, God forbid, that sounds awful.
That's a championship they could add just for the winter.
Bring back GP2 Asia.
Yeah. Eke some more money out. Yes, as we did. But it's not all bad. Right now, the ecosystem is pretty healthy. But I think we're all little bit afraid that once the balloon pops in junior single-seaters, you lose a lot of quality and probably also quantity in a very quick time frame. And I think they need to act to avoid that.
Well, the counter argument to that is you could argue it's been pretty stable for a while, so it's positive from that in that regard. But yeah, just because things have been as they are doesn't mean they're going to go on. I mean, I must admit, I suspect that the simplest light touch thing that could be done is at least create scope for there to be a Renault World Series style competitor series to F2. Now, that's not necessarily something that you'd want to do because competition can be bad for individual businesses. And I'm also not somebody who will always advocate free market solves everything, because it doesn't. But at least it could create the space for an alternative that does give you a pathway. I think it's good that there's an FIA sort of defined pathway, but having a dampening effect on any alternatives, I think, is a bit of a danger, because it would be nice to have someone who can go a little bit of a different way into Formula One. That's what I'd quite like to see.
And if that alternative pathway is populated by the same teams, does that change anything for you? Because it probably would be the same teams that are in F2 and F3.
Oh, certainly, yeah. Just as that you get a lot of the same teams in all sorts of championships. So, yeah, you're never going to be able to get around that. But at least that creates some pressure as well, because you might then get in them saying, well, actually, F2 isn't such a great business proposition. So actually this mythical series I've just made up, which depends on a manufacturer throwing money in, so no guarantee it would happen. But that has a little bit of a controlling effect in just to making sure prices don't run away too much, and it perhaps creates a motivating force. Yeah, I'd at least like there to be the scope for that. But I feel that, let's say I had countless amounts of money that I wanted to put into Formula Straw 3.5 to create.
I was going to call it Formula Edd, but
Formula Edd's snappier. But I'm going to go to the FIA and say, how many super license points is it worth? And initially, it's going to be very little. And even when it proves its brilliance, which of course it would be, it's still not going to get so much. So that inhibits the business side of things. So that's maybe something I'd like there to be a willingness to do. And of course, we can't say emphatically there isn't a willingness to do, because the FIA will say, well, they'll hear everyone out, won't they? Because there isn't an example of someone trying to do that. So,
you know what you have to do once you're the billionaire that you're claiming to be, hypothetically? Go to IndyCar and launch IndyCar Europe.
Yeah, well, there we go.
And then you'd have a counterweight.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a good counterbalance there. Interesting ideas, but I think what we've been able to show here is it's a complicated situation without easy answers. It's very easy to identify the problems and run through them, and it's very easy to come up with a solution that's an end point, but the process to get to that is very, very difficult. And we should be also, I think, careful to recognise, as we said, that actually it's not all bad. There's the fact there's a strong F2 championship, a strong F3 championship. It runs on the F1 undercard, so it's visible. You know, there was a time, for a long time, F2, I mean, F3000 used to complain before they joined the F1 support bill that nobody would pay any attention because you'd have a race in March in Donington Park and there'd be 3 men and a dog in the crowd and no television, so people aren't able to see it. So there are things that have improved a lot, aren't there, Nelson? So we shouldn't completely dismiss that.
We just want it to stay as healthy as it is right now. I think that's the onus is on the FIA and the teams and the organizers there. But right now it's healthy. It just has to stay like this, and it has to be accessible for a lot more people than it is right now.
Yeah, that's certainly the aim for motorsports. Any final thoughts from you, Samarth? Are you happy with where we've got to?
Well, my only thought, just going back to what you said in terms of competition, is there's no guarantee that if there was competition, they would allow you to get the same amount of super license points to then join F1 using it, which would be
that's the trouble.
It would be easy to cripple the competition. But yeah, I'd like to agree with Nelson as well. I think that the single season ladder is doing a lot of good things as well. It's been exciting this year. It's been good fun, even though it's been hard to judge truly maybe who's the best. But, it always is hard to judge. I mean, the points only tell half of the story. So I've been enjoying it. So and that's good. And it does seem healthy. And I am looking forward to seeing what the new F3 car even throws up next season, if it does the same thing. In terms of changes in the team's hierarchy. So yeah, it's been really healthy. That's all I'd like to add.
Yeah, so let's see what comes in the coming years. Because as Nelson has warned, there's always the danger that the bubble bursts, and they should always be trying to curate it and direct it and steer it so that it works well for the sport as a whole, not just for those who are operating it. So thanks very much, Nelson and Samarth, for your input and your answers. For everyone listening to this, if you have any thoughts, let us know on social media, or if you're a member through our Patreon page, what you think about this, and I'm sure it's a topic we'll return to in the future. And the F1 season is rapidly approaching in terms of starting again after this weird mini break, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.
The Athletic.
Did you know users searched football on eBay.com last season 12,000 times per hour? That's some serious searching. eBay has been the home of collectibles since 1995 and is the largest online marketplace for trading cards. Premium trading card singles, live card breaks, unique game-used memorabilia, all the epic finds you need are right here on eBay. Collect with confidence by downloading the eBay app on the App Store or by going straight to ebay.com/theathletic. That's ebay.com/theathletic. Come through and collect with us today. As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code THEATHLETIC, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code THEATHLETIC. Make your first deposit of at least $10, place your first bet on any game, and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code THEATHLETIC and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.